Okay, hello and welcome, everybody. We are happy to see you and to welcome you. This is the second of a two-part series called The Ethics of War, and we are somewhat unfortunately offering this course. This was not supposed to be offered, but as such, as we are now day 61 of the war since Simchat Torah, finding ourselves, preoccupied in every single way. And one of those ways is to think about the right and wrongs of war and what Judaism has to say when it comes to the ethics of war. We are blessed to be in the presence of Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, a person that's dedicated and spent much time to thinking about these ideas and even writing about them in his new forthcoming book. Tonight's session is called The Captive Dilemma, Then and Now, Halachic Perspectives on Freeing the Hostages. Very timely and very important discussion. Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for joining us here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind words and introduction. It's good to be back with this crowd, both live and on tape as it comes along. So I'm looking at the Ynet news site, and you see on it that I don't know if you follow along this, but you can see they have here daily reports of the days of the war, 61 days of the war now. The last siren is at 5:40. Kerem Shalom, the 38 sirens today. And the highlight always, meaning they're always here on this, is that there are 138 captives still in Gaza, with another 118 who have been already released, thank God. By the way, I think this number is a little bit off because there are 4 other captives. We're discussing this today on the radio. There are 4 other captives who are still there from 2014, 2015, including 2 killed soldiers, Oron Shaul and oh my God, I'm blanking now. Rabbi Fishman, do you remember? Terrible. 1 second, it'll come back to me 1 second. No, I feel bad. No, I want to make sure I have the and Hadar Golden, right? Who are the 2 soldiers that are still captive from 2014, 2015. And I start with that factor A because I want to dedicate the shir in terms of the quick release of these captives, but also to note the fact that we've had a captive situation with bodies and 2 citizens, both mentally unstable, who crossed the border and were taken captive brutally by Hamas in 2015 for no good reason except for the fact that they thought it would be bargaining chips in order to get out some of their own people. So they've been holding these 2 mentally unstable Israelis for the last 8 years, which is kind of horrifying on so many different levels. But Israel did not and has not traded for the bodies of Hadar Golden or Oron Shaul, as opposed to what it did after the 2006 war with Lebanon, in 2008, with regard to the bodies of Regev and Goldenwasser, and as opposed to the Gilad Shalit deal. Gilad Shalit, of course, was alive, for whom they released 1,000 plus prisoners, including the current head of Hamas in Gaza. And so with this introduction alone, I hope you get a feel for how loaded of a topic this is. You might have seen on the news that yesterday, the families, I don't think it's just representatives, really all the families of those still being held hostage in Gaza, including some people who just were released last week, went and met with the, sort of the small security cabinet led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it was a tense meeting by all accounts. And the tension sort of lies in the following, where the families of the Chatufim are more or less saying, I wouldn't say everyone, but there's certainly a message that's coming out from some of them. Our loved ones' lives are at risk. Trust us. We know we were in captivity. They're not being fed. They might be even being tortured. There's all sorts of concerns, particularly for the younger women hostages. And they're basically saying, you need to get them out now, and that means at all cost. And the pushback is that it's not clear that such a deal is on the table, but there's sort of two pushbacks. One is that the way to get Hamas to negotiate is to force them with military pressure. And the second argument, which hasn't really been made so much publicly by the cabinet members, but has been made by other politicians and other thinkers in Israel, is more along the lines of this isn't the priority, meaning it is a priority. It is something which is important, but the priority and the only priority that really counts is defeating Hamas. And that means we can't take any more breaks in order to release prisoners. It means we can't release Hamas prisoners from jails anymore. It means that the only option to freeing them is to win the war. Now, this becomes tricky because, as you might have seen, the Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that one of the things that Israel is considering, which has been floated for a while, which was done by Egypt several years ago with regard to tunnels for going from Gaza to Egypt, was that they'd flood the tunnels with seawater. Take a few weeks, right? But you can more or less flood these tunnels, underground tunnels, destroy the tunnels, make them uninhabitable. And of course, there are two great concerns there. One is that there might be some long-term damage to the fresh water supply in Gaza. But the second one, which I think is more present on many Israeli minds, is if you flood the tunnels to try to get the terrorists out, you might also be harming or killing the captives who are there. And I think there's no question that the captives are being held at this point as human shields. And this raises all sorts of very, very deep and profound questions. And the question becomes, what does Judaism have to say about this issue? And unfortunately, I've written a book now on Jewish military ethics. Please God, should be out at the end of the month. I think December 21st, supposed to be in the warehouse. You can see it on the Magid website. It's called Ethics of Our Fighters. And one of the things I mentioned this last week is that, there wasn't always a tremendous amount of Jewish or certainly halachic writing about war when Jews weren't fighting wars for many centuries. But what there is a lot of discussion about, both in the Talmud, medieval and early modern period, as we're going to see the very contemporary period as well, is this halachic question of redeeming captives. Meaning, as opposed to other areas of the military ethics, where you might not find as much material as you like, might not find as many precedents, when it comes to the question of redeeming captives, this is something which is actually very very exhaustively, I shouldn't say exhaustively, but very deeply covered in halachic literature. And it was citing this literature, sort of sources like along the lines I'm going to show you right now, which has been sort of brought up in many ways in the Israeli context. So if you look, and this of course is relevant because this was from Parshat Lech Lecha, right soon, right after the war had begun, 3 weeks later, we read in the Torah the importance of redeeming captives from the model of Avram Avinu, from Abraham. Vayishma Avram ki nishba achi vayrekech hanicha. He hears that Lot has been taken captive. What does he do? He gets 318 men together, and they chase after the kings that have taken him captive and redeem him. So right away, one of the first stories of the Bible is teaching this element, as the Radak says, comments on this passage. It says, this teaches us the element of the importance of loyalty. Loyalty is a great value. And loyalty to our people, which means you go and redeem them. But of course, in this case, the redemption was through military means. More akin to what we famously praise was the story of Entebbe raid. Right? If you remember the Entebbe raid, 1976, 100 plus Jewish hostages are taken to Uganda, and Israel launches what's later known as Operation Yoni, named after Yoni Netanyahu, who was killed in action, the only soldier killed in action that day. And Israel goes and redeems and frees these captives, with the exception of 3 who are in the hospital and were promptly executed by the Ugandan leader. So Israel, has this model, but of course, throughout the ages, we didn't always have such an army and the ability to do such things. And the notions of the importance of redeeming captives is seen in many sources. I brought you here 2, one from the Rambam, who talks about how Pidyon Shvuyim, Kodem Lefarnasat Aniyim, right? It's even more important than providing for the poor. And there's no greater mitzvah than that. Because the captive is included in those who are hungry, who are thirsty, who are naked, and who have their lives in danger. In other words, what the Rambam is teaching us is that the shavoi, the captive, is seen as being the ultimate need of charity, of redemption, because he's got everything that you might think about, people you might want to support. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they're naked, and they are their lives are in danger. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins, based on this notion, it brings down any moment you delay, when you could have redeemed them earlier, it's as if you have killed the person. And this is a powerful statement because it highlights the fact that there's a real danger in not redeeming people and a real moral imperative. And indeed, in the first week or two of the war, sorry, we're having something, air conditioning. In the first week or two of the war, an Israeli scholar named Michael Manikin, who's also written a book recently about military ethics in Judaism, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, of all places, in which he claimed that Jewish law teaches that there's utmost importance to redeeming captives, and therefore, at all costs, should the captives be redeemed. Now, as he clearly knows then, and this idea is bandied about, although it's not really clear this is an actual option on the table, but it seems that he had in mind here, basically, all for all. We get back 240 captives, we release all Palestinian prisoners from jails. And you ask yourself, like, is that really what we should be doing here? Is that what we should do now to release the 140 plus who are still in captivity, whether dead or alive, by the way? Right? Some of them seems clearly not to be alive. We know that from a number of different sources. We know that several of the figures, including many of the soldiers, were taken captive. And the question becomes, is that what we should be doing right now? Is that even under consideration? Meaning, after all, if you say, like the Shulchan Aruch, that delaying any moment, and this is exactly what some of the hostages' parents were saying yesterday. They're saying, any moment of delay, it's as if you are killing these people. I myself, which is sort of surreal, know two people whose sons are in captivity in Gaza right now. I know the people personally, I know the parents personally, which is a very, it's a small country, Israel, but it's sort of this surreal reality of seeing, people that on the front cover of Time magazine, right, talking about their son Hirsch, Hirsch Goldberg Poland. I know his parents for many years, and the Peres family has their son who was a soldier who was taken captive, and it's a serious issue, right? And I don't want to take it lightly by any means, and certainly I hope and pray and hope that Israel is able to bring them back. But what I want to argue tonight is that the Jewish tradition is much, 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 much more nuanced on this issue, and in fact, that there has always been understood that there are limitations, in fact, to what we do to bring back captives, as we're going to see right now. And this comes up in the Mishnah in Gittin, which is talking about things that we do for Tikkun Olam. Right? This is an expression you're familiar with, of course. Tikkun Olam, fixing the world. And the two prakim in Masechet Gittin and the Mishnah discuss this idea. And they say, "Ein podin et hashvuim yetar kedei demehen mepnei tikkun haolam." One should not redeem a captive more from their value, seemingly their market value as slaves. After all, this is 2nd century CE. Slaves are certainly being sold, and many captives are being sold as slaves on the slave market, Roman slave market, other slave markets. And the opportunity then would have come about. Maybe we can redeem people who are being sold as slaves and say, let's just redeem them and then bring them back to freedom. But the Mishnah tells us, don't do too much. Don't go past the amount that they're worth. And it's explained in the Gemara. They ask, well, what exactly is this? What is this restriction? After all, we do know how important it is, how grave a mitzvah is to do Pidyon Shvuim. And the Gemara asks, there might be two possible reasons. One, Mishum duchka de tzibura, If you overpay, then you're going to exhaust all of the community's resources. They won't have money. And so you got to make sure you limit the amount of money being utilized. Odilma, mishum de lo liger below v'laiti tfei. If you overpay, what are people going to say? The Jews overpay. So let's take them captive, and then we'll be able to sell them for greater money. And basically, by overpaying, you're going to be incentivizing captive taking. And the Gemara tries to resolve this issue by telling a story in which a very wealthy person redeems his daughter for an exorbitant amount of money. And so you could say this proves that the only concern is duchka de tzibura, the burden on the community. Because after all, if the community is not being burdened by this person being redeemed, then there should be no problem. And since the wealthy father is paying all the exorbitant price, this is not an imposition on the community at all. To which the Gemara answers, no, no, no. That might be the case because maybe this person did it, but against the will of the rabbis. And this is a pretty powerful statement because you understand that on the one hand, the Gemara is telling us that individuals are going to do everything they can to bring back their loved ones. And they're not even actually necessarily critical of it. It's interesting. But they are saying this might not be what we want to see because you understand that while it might help you to redeem the individual and this father's grief and this father's plight and his daughter's plight might be resolved by this exorbitant price, it would create a terrible problem because it'll be understood that Jews are worth more as captives. And indeed, the Shulchan Aruch brings down la halacha, and it says, don't overpay for them. Because we don't want a situation where our enemies are going to great lengths to take Jews captive, meaning it seems that we rule like the second issue. It's not just a question of the financial position on the community. It's also that we don't want to incentivize people taking captives frequently, right? And therefore, we make a limit on this, although he does note two exceptions. One exception is that a person can redeem themselves. And here you start to see a little bit of a balance between the individual plight and what they want to do because they have their interest in mind, as opposed to seeing a much broader community perspective on the issue. And the Shulchan Aruch says, listen, there are limits, though, to this regulation. We allow an individual, and many bring that as well, to redeem themselves, may say as well for your spouse. We allow people to redeem at exorbitant prices for themselves. Many we understand there's only so much limits we can put on this issue. And interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch brings down a position which is founded from a story in Masechet Gittin coming up, in which he also says that if it's for a great communal leader, like a Talmid Chacham, a great scholar, for him as well, we would go and redeem at an exorbitant price. And the basis of this ruling is an interesting story in the Gemara in Gittin that tells the story of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania. Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania is living after the Churban, after the destruction of the Jewish people, and he goes to Rome, where, of course, many Jewish captives are taken, and he sees a young child who's in the prison, who's captured, a beautiful child, and he decides, I'm going to redeem him at all costs, because I know that this child is going to be a great teacher in the Jewish people, and ultimately this child became Rebbe Ishmael ben Elisha. Okay, so from here, we have a little bit of this idea that maybe there are times that we would allow, and there are no regulations. And the commentators ask and say, listen, why was this allowed? I mean, after all, the whole point of having a regulation is that everyone's going to say, my case is exceptional. My daughter's exceptional. This time of Chacham is exceptional. My case is different. And the whole point of having a rule is to say, don't break the rule because it will incentivize slave taking. And the Meiri and others say, well, let's think about this period, post-Churban, post-destruction, post the fall of Beitar, 135, fall of Bar Kokhba rebellion. What's the status of the Jewish people at this point? A, they're in diaspora, they are powerless, and It's sort of a wartime situation. And so one of the explanations given is that when you're in a wartime situation, well, that might be very different because they're already going to be taking captives anyway. In other words, one of the justifications might be that when captives are being taken anyway, then this regulation didn't apply. It was only applicable in sort of a regular, generally peaceful time period. Now, whatever the explanation might be, I think already in the Talmud you see this tension. On the one hand, there's a logic to the Mishnah of limiting what we can pay, but at the same time, there's also this understanding that individuals are going to do a lot to redeem themselves, their loved ones, and many valuable people. And maybe there's a lot of justification for that approach as well. And what's interesting is that if you look in the various commentators of the 16th and earlier eras, but certainly in the 16th century, it becomes very clear. It is readily seen that Jews tended to pay at all costs to get back other Jews or loved ones. So I brought here the position brought out of the Yam Shel Shlomo, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, 16th century Poland, where he says, "Va'inna in our times, anshe gomle chasadim ba'aretz torgama v'smuchim lem podim ashvim yoter v'chtechaneim." People in the areas of various areas. We have this from both from Sephardic and Ashkenazic sources as well. We redeem at all costs. And we don't worry about the imposition on the community, right? Because he says as follows: we don't have that many people. Meaning, right? We're getting destroyed in different ways over different time periods in the Galus. And v'yesh lachus al yeter pleta, and we should have mercy on the remnants, the refugees who remain. Shalot techabeg achalet Israel, because we don't want to have a situation where the spark, right, the Jewish spark of the Jewish people is entirely put out and extinguished. And therefore, he says it is important we do, this is the practice to redeem. And he says it also might be that perhaps that the situation we're dealing with is not just regular captives speaking, but also ones in which they have Yisurim, Veinuim, torture, and being forced to violate Judaism and to work on Shabbat. And there's a fear of their lives being taken, and therefore the practice is to go and redeem people. However, he then brings a fascinating story, which tells us this wasn't always so clear. Because he tells us the story of Rabbi Shlomo Luria, of Rabbi he's the one talking, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg in the 13th century. And he's a great German scholar who's taken captive. And Rabbi Rothenburg, Marami Rothenburg, says, "Do not redeem me for beyond the price, because if you do that, that will lead all of the scholars of Israel to be taken captive, and that will cause the end of Torah teaching." And as the Maharshal points out, his own student, Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, flees from Germany and successfully makes it to Spain at this time, where he continues his illustrious rabbinic career, showing us that there are sometimes values which make it important, even at the cost of his own life. He dies in captivity. Do not redeem me, because this is dangerous for the Jewish people. Now, if you think about it, these are really interesting stories and tragic in a lot of ways. But the question becomes is this relevant at all for our current situation? Meaning, is the stories of Jews in Europe, Spain, in Sephardic lands, right, where we hear about the redemption coming of captives, is this really relevant at all for our state of Israel? Because let's think about the differences. Back then, we're talking about money. Okay, here we're talking about freeing captives. Okay, now that's not freeing captives, freeing terrorists from jail. And that is a little bit different, because the fear has always been you free terrorists, and what ends up happening? They go back to terror, right? Which we've seen repeatedly, actually. And so that's one factor, which is very different, right? What's being ransomed here, not what's being bartered here to ransom the captives. And the second factor, major factor, is then remember what the Maharshal said is here we're having mercy on the remnants of the Jewish people, etc. But let's think about this for a moment, because today, then, we were having a situation where we didn't have a power, we didn't have sovereignty. Today we have a state. And once you've got a state, you've got an army, right? And you have to be responsible for a whole collective vision, both short-term and long-term, and short-term and long-term political and military strategy. It's different. The calculations and what you're going to do is an ad hoc decision by a small community in order to redeem people. And so when this issue really came to the fore is 1985, Israel had a very inconsistent position over the years of swaps, what they would do. They would clearly do the traditional, widely accepted prisoner swaps, prisoners of war swaps, right? You have soldiers taking both sides in 48 or in 49 and 56, 67, 73. And you have traditional soldier swaps, right, of all the POWs. But what about cases in which soldiers have been taken captive, not been released, particularly taken captive by non-armies, right, by terrorist groups, and they're demanding the release of terrorists in order to free them? So this issue came up in 1985, what's known as Iskat Jabril, the Jabril deal, in which Prime Minister Shimon Peres, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, I think he was the prime minister then, and Rabin was the foreign minister. Remember that deal, that arrangement then? Prime Minister Peres at the time. Am I getting all confused? Prime Minister Peres. Yeah, Prime Minister Peres. Sorry, Rabin was defense minister. In any case, so they made this deal to release to the free 1,185 prisoners in order to free 3 live Israeli soldiers. And it caused a great amount of controversy. And one of those who came out strongly against the Jabril deal was Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi. We saw last week as well that Rabbi Goren did not hesitate to speaking out when he wanted to speak out on issues. And Rabbi Goren speaks out very publicly and writes a very fierce condemnation of the deal, and writes a whole halachic treatise of this in the newspaper called Hatzofeh. And in it, he says, listen, we know how important it is, of Pidyon Shvuyim. And it's the case, how is it possible that the Mishnah put limitations and regulated it? Nothing should stand before Pikuach Nefesh. Answer, because in this case, when you redeem Jews, what are you doing? You might endanger other Jews because you're incentivizing, right, captive taking. And that's why we have a regulation. And here he's most as well, that don't forget, you're going to be releasing 1,150 terrorists. So you're going to be endangering not only by incentivizing future captive taking, but you also, this isn't money they're asking for. They're asking for terrorists to be released. And therefore, he says, this is causing pikuach nefesh of the rabbin. It is causing misaken et shlom hatzibor. And when it's misaken et shlom hatzibor, that's the principle of the Mishnah. We do not redeem greater than the going price. This is an usher deal, forbidden deal, b'nigud l'din Torah v'hahalacha. And he writes this, and then the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv at the time, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, publishes his own treatise against Rav Goren. And basically says, listen, you're worried about Pikuach Nefesh. Do you not think that the defense minister is aware of the fact there's a possibility that releasing terrorists is going to endanger Jewish people? But let's also recognize, if we don't redeem these 3 live soldiers, what are we also doing? Endangering the Jewish people. Why? And he says, because when soldiers go into the army, They need to know that Medina Israel Yaseh Takol. State of Israel will do everything in order to bring them back if something happens. Why? Because that's what makes them fight fearlessly, or as fearlessly as possible. And if they fear that this won't work, if they fear that the state of Israel won't really have their back at all times, then it's going to make them hesitate about coming into contact with the enemy, approaching the enemy, and so on. And so what Chaim David Levi says is that there's a pikuach nefesh imperative to go and maintain the morale of the soldiers by saying that we'll do everything, whatever it takes, in order to free them from captivity. Now, it's an interesting debate, and the question is, who is right? So here's a funny factoid, or interesting trivia question. When Rav Goren publishes, excuse me, before I get to Rav Goren, when Chaim David Levi ends his tshuva, he says, well, listen, all I'm saying is that it's mutter, it's permissible to make this trade. But I'm not saying it's required, because there are considerations on both sides. All I'm saying is that it's legitimate for the state of Israel to make a decision that it is in the both individual and national interest to redeem at all costs. And it's interesting that Rav Goren, meaning he's modifying his position, that Rav Goren, when he republishes this essay in his book, Torah Medina, of different halachic issues related to the running of a state, Rav Goren ends the tshuva, which he had, remember, came out very strongly publicly against the prisoner swap, and says, you know what? Maybe I was wrong. Because maybe in a case of shvuei milchama shel chayalim, remember we said earlier that you have the ability to redeem yourself at all costs? Shulchan Aruch said we understand there's limitations. And he says soldiers are our agents. They're not just anyone. They were sent by the state, for the state, to act on our behalf. And therefore, the rule doesn't apply to them because they were acting b'shlichut hamedina. Right? They were acting to on our behalf, and therefore, as if their own bodies, we've got to redeem them. Now, the question is, is that right? And there are other factors. So it's interesting. Rav Yisraeli, Shaul Yisraeli, we saw him last week as well, also writes a tshuva about this topic and says, I want to put in another factor, which is that, we're trying to balance here the national security needs. But there's another factor to keep in mind, because you could say, what we should prioritize is we know for sure that those who are going to be that are in captivity have a sakana nefashot levadai, right? For sure they're in danger. The long-term considerations of redeeming terrorists is what we call a shema. We're not sure. And so he says that it seems to him that we should prioritize the absolute pikuach nefesh of those who are truly endangered over the potential future strategic cost of such a deal. But then he adds a very interesting factor. He says, I look back at Avram Avinu, Abraham, our forefather, and I ask myself, when he fought and redeemed Lot, that was a great Kiddush Hashem, sanctified the name of God, because he showed strength, he showed power, he showed loyalty, and he brought his nephew home. If we give in to the demands of terrorists, maybe this is a Chilul Hashem, and it makes us look weak. And looking weak is a Chilul Hashem, as if God's people are weak, and B, it's endangering, particularly in our neighborhood, because its signs of weakness are easily taken as you're ready to be attacked, right? You're not deterring people, you're not fearing it. And so he leaves it as an open question. And now we have to ask, having looked at all of the prisoner swaps over the past, 30 years, how has this worked out? So on the one hand, we've brought back some of the soldiers. Interestingly enough, in 86, Ron Arad, fighter pilot, gets taken captive, and Israel rejects prisoner swaps at the time, right? Rejects releasing terrorists on his behalf. And what happens to Ron Arad? Well, we don't really know. but the presumption is they died in captivity. So it's a serious matter. If you don't make the deal, sometimes the opportunity for the deal doesn't come around and people die. And so you understand that it's complicated. We also have the example of Nachshon Waxman, who's taken a soldier taken hostage in, I think, 93, 94. And Israel, then Prime Minister Rabin, launches a raid to free him, and Waxman and the head of the raid are killed in the process. Okay? But then you look at the Shalit deal, and you say, okay, well, Shalit's home and well, that's good. But look who we released. In the Jabril deal in 85, we released Ahmad Yassin, who later became the spiritual head of Hamas. We ultimately had to assassinate after he builds up his terror activity. And now look at Shalit. Many, over, let's say about half of those prisoners released went back to terror, including the current head of the military leader of Hamas in Gaza. And so you ask, is this really a question of, well, we're not sure if this is a national security risk? Or might you say, yes, the prisoners are in danger, but there is a bona fide national security risk by showing weakness and by releasing terrorists to go back to terror. And that is, I think, where it really comes down to what's going on in Israel right now, which is on the one hand, for the last 30 years, we've been making these lopsided trades to bring people back out of captivity. We're very happy to have the soldiers back. Same, we're very happy to have 130 plus citizens and foreigners who were released over the past couple of weeks. But keep in mind, we released terrorists. Right? And you say, oh, the women and children, the women, first of all, the children are like 17. Right? They're not exactly kids anymore. And, this whole thing, we release women. Are women not capable terrorists? They've shown themselves to be quite capable as terrorists. So, this whole notion is a very endangering one, in which you've put out people who are convicted as terrorists. And you might also be sending a message. The message is, don't worry about committing terror, because if you're getting taken to prison, they'll take care of you. Right? They're not going to be like we are. Right? The Israeli captives were fed a piece of pita and then get a shower for 50-something days. Right? Whereas Palestinian prisoners get 3 meals a day. Right? So it's a entirely different equation. And so part of the danger is that these deals have totally endangered the Jewish state. And that is, reasonable people can disagree on this issue. But you see to the point where some people say Israel should just treat the captives as if they're dead. Meaning fight, surrender or die, and whatever happens to the captives happens. A, because it's not so clear there's much we can do. We don't know where they're being held. So if we bomb, we don't really know for sure where they are. And B, even if we did know where they were, it doesn't matter. We've got to win. That is the priority. And my own perspective on this is that the priority has to be on winning the war and killing Hamas, but that doesn't mean we just say we don't care about the captives. But I would have never myself, of course, people can disagree on this, I would never myself stated that the goals of the war are twofold: to destroy Hamas and to bring back the captives. I would have formulated it as the goals of the war are to win this war, to destroy Hamas and their capabilities. And part of doing that is securing the future of the Jewish people, including those who are endangered by this most imminently, the captives in Gaza. But it's not totally clear to me if we would have a choice. Some people put it this way: of, okay, let's end the war but bring back the captives alive, but not get rid of Hamas. When we do it, I think that'd be very, very dangerous, both in the south and the north. But that's my own opinion on this. What I'm trying to show you is that there are different values here in play in the Jewish tradition. And while I don't know if there's a definitive answer offered by the Jewish tradition on this question, I do think it's clear that there's going to be a balance of values at play. And this goes back to something I spoke about last week as well. Military ethics, Jewish military ethics, like Jewish medical ethics, like we do at Matai, and many, many other ethical questions are always going to be a question of taking into account Jewish values, each of which on their own have strong moral appeals, each of which on their own can be appealed to as saying, okay, this makes sense. But sometimes those values don't all work and jive together. And the question becomes is which value is going to dominate in this scenario? And I think in this respect, the sugyot, the topics, can give us a good perspective of the values at play, but ultimately reasonable people are going to have bits of disagreements on this issue, which is why Rav Yisraeli and Rav Goren of Chaim David Levi could have such fierce disagreement about the Jabril deal, but ultimately switch around their positions in some ways and become much, much more nuanced as time went along because we understand the difficulties and dynamics of the situation. I'll take questions here. I'll stop here and maybe some questions and comments as we, with regard to the sources that we saw or the current dilemma that we're facing.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Brody. This is a broad question, and you presented the sources and you presented the, let's say, two major approaches and the dispute between them. Where does that leave us practically? I know that's an impossible question to answer, but it's like, okay, practically speaking, what are we supposed to do?
So here, I put my cap on as someone who thinks about military strategy, but I don't pretend to be a full-fledged expert on this by any means. I write about this, I think about these issues, and tell you the following. What leaves us to do is to take these values and try to figure out how to balance these values. My own particular issue on this, my own particular opinion on this is that the reason why Chazal imposed limits on redeeming captives is they understood well that when you give everything and do everything you can to redeem captives, it endangers the national people and interest. And that's what's happened. And we tried this out for the last 30 years, and it's pretty clear that it has endangered us. In other words, we released terrorists in 85, and they become even worse terrorists, founders of Hamas. We released terrorists in the Shalit deal. We released terrorists in the deal to bring back the two killed soldiers, Regev and Goldwasser. And it's not surprising. It's not like when they're sitting in jail, they learn how to be Mother Teresa and, Rosa B'Tshuva and whatnot. They get degrees. They learn some good strategies. They've interviewed the head of Hamas, said, yeah, in jail, I learned all about Israeli society. I spoke Hebrew. I learned Hebrew. This is crazy in my mind. And so, my own perspective on this is that it really is endangering. And my belief is, and I think it's hard to dispute this, the reason why Gilad Shalit was taken captive and sat there for 5 years is because of the Jabril deal. And it's pretty obvious right now that the reason why they took 240 people captive is they knew that this would be a human shield that they could utilize to protect themselves. And they knew this would be a tactic which could help release Palestinian terrorists from jails. That's very endangering for us. And we can't let that go on anymore, in my mind. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say in some ways because I do understand what's at stake right now. Like I said to you, I know two people who have sons who are in captivity in Gaza. I don't take that lightly whatsoever, but I don't think that necessarily that should be the number one priority. Now, of course, if we can, and we should strive to impose pressure in order to get them released, impose pressure to just release them. That'd be amazing and great and wonderful. But there are limits to what we can expect to be done. And part of the problem is that Israeli politicians, I think some of them who feel this way don't have the backbone to say it in public. They're not being honest. They're not having the backbone to say, that. Now it could be that that's too hard to say. It could be that no one will in the social media age, no one will be able to respect that. I don't know. There are a couple of politicians who try to say something along these lines, and said in such insensitive ways that like everyone got really angry at them. And again, I'm not saying to treat the captives as if they're dead and don't be concerned with them. But I am saying that the priority has to be the military success and military advancement. Richard.
Rabbi, you've very clearly explained to us the almost impossible calculation that has to be done here. And by going through the halacha, you showed the old maxim. You have three rabbis in a room and you have 7 opinions. Because rabbis change opinions, as you made clear. So very appreciated, the explanations that you gave. I'm wondering, in the present situation, if, to complicate things even more, you have the extreme pressure of the United States on Israel, the extent of which we don't really know, but we know it's there. Unless the United States is just posturing in order for domestic political reasons, that they're saying, Israel has to be more precise, Israel has to be more careful, and they're really maybe saying to Israel, wink, 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 nod, nod. But we don't know that, and I doubt that's the case. But if Israel, the United States, let's assume, is putting on this tremendous pressure, then Israel could say, okay, we have a deal on, we have a deal for more hostages. We're going to have another ceasefire, so they don't have to wrestle with this terrible dilemma, because the importance of having Israel as an ally is important for winning the war. We know that. So they can show that they are, ready to do a swap, but the real reason behind it is because they have to appease the United States and pause and have another temporary ceasefire.
Yeah, so it could be. It's hard to know fully. Obviously a ceasefire for a swapping of, and the language here is important. They are swapping kidnapped citizens, right, for terrorists. So those ceasefires are allow not only that, of course, but also, in this case that we saw in the past time, humanitarian quote unquote gestures that are brought in, fuel, etc. And so, there's a little bit of a combination of, well, which is the chicken, which is the egg? Is it we need to have a ceasefire, humanitarian pause? So we're going to say this is for the sake of redeeming the captures. That's what sort of you're pushing at, or is which is the opposite direction? It's hard to know. There are obviously a lot of different factors going to play in different types of considerations here. Certainly, the international pressure and the international is a factor that has to be taken into account here. But it's hard to know for sure. Like if Israel said, "We're not doing this anymore," right? Just we're not interested in it anymore. Would that something happen there? I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to know, Richard. It's very hard to know. There's obviously multiple factors going on here. I don't think that was fully the case, though, because I do think that there are many Israelis and many Israeli politicians who think that there's a priority here of returning the captives. And by the way, the Israeli government made it very clear they have 2 aims to the war: to destroy Hamas's governing capability and to bring back the captives. You're sort of setting it up in that way, right, for a situation where you might have conflicts between those 2 goals. So
what do you say, Rabbi? What do you say? I've had people say to me that it's really an exchange of captives. And I say, well, what do you mean? They say, well, a lot of the prisoners, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, were not convicted. They're there on administrative detention. And so they've never been tried. They've never had a sentence of a determined amount of time.
Right.
They throw rocks. They're 17. So they're captives too, because that's not rule of law when you have administrative detention. What do you say
Right,
to
yeah.
those people?
Well, I think there's a real difference between being taken and imprisoned for doing a criminal or terrorist activity, like throwing rocks, which you're right, could be in some of those cases they haven't been tried yet. And many other cases, of course, they have been, but it could be in these cases. And that was one of the reasons why we felt it was easier to release these people. But they're not captives. They're just not captives. Right? Israel was not looking to take these people into consideration. The only reason why those people were taken into Israeli jails is because they were threatening Israelis and national security. The equation is terrifying. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we see this in the media as well. Right? A lot of different ways in which the media sort of equated the two, and it's part of the problem of the media right now. Bridge asked an interesting question. Did anyone ask Gilad Shalit what he thought of the deal? I don't know if anyone's asked him afterwards, did he think it was right or wrong? It's clear that his family felt that this was right, and this was the right thing to do, and they certainly put pressure on Israel to make such a trade. It's hard to know. I remember when the Shalit deal happened, one of my nephews was entering the army, and he said to my brother, if God forbid this happens to me, don't do this. But I think he had a mind if they were just redeeming for his body. Right? I mean, this in my mind is just outrageous. Like, there's no reason we should be ever releasing a terrorist to bring back a body, a corpse for burial. I just think that's horrible, and that's exactly what we did. We released a terrible, terrible Hezbollah terrorist in order to bring back another 5, 6 more who killed a mother and 2 children, like beat their heads to a rock, or beat their heads with a rock, or both actually, I think it was, and then gets released, and he now lives in Lebanon and is married to a media personality who's a Lebanese beauty queen. This is the message that we're sending, like that's crazy to me. But I don't know always. Again, if you think like Rav Israeli, so the morale factor would say it doesn't matter what the person's personal position is, the soldier. We need our soldiers in general to know that we'll always do anything. We need our parents of soldiers to know that we'll do everything to bring back their boys and girls. And that is something which is valuable. I do agree that is valuable, and I think that's part of the conversation here as well. Okay, any more questions? So this is a deep topic. I have my opinions on this, but even you can tell from my opinion, I'm hedging a little bit. I agree, and I will tell you that when I saw all these wonderful pictures of the captives being released, and it seems they were drugged and this and that, whatever it might be, but at the end of the day, seeing them back with their families. And seeing, there's a picture yesterday, I think, of a 6-year-old who went back to her kindergarten. And, it was amazing. I mean, it was very exciting. And, you wish people, and some of the teenagers are now doing TikTok videos. They're making jokes. They're going to do, 5 credits of Arabic easily, type of thing, for the Bagriyot here in Israel. So the matriculation exams. It's a beautiful thing, and it's very rewarding to see that. And, I hope that the long-term damages of releasing people for their safety won't be outweighed. But, here is only 3 per person. And I don't know. I feel a little bit better about this. But, I don't know. The thought of releasing people with the blood on their hands, as they say, is very, very disturbing to me, including, by the way, to the families of the victims. Keep in mind, there are victims who are terrorized by these terrorists who would be released. And what do you say to them and their families? I mean, I don't know. So I hope and pray that we will have a better resolution to this. המקום ירחם עליהם ויצא מצר לרווחה, מאפל לרעה ומשיבול לגאולה, השטר בגלה וזמן קריב ואמר עליהם. Thank you so much.
Amen. Thank you very much, Rabbi Brody. I'm not sure whether I'm uplifted or depressed after that, and I don't mean that personally, but you know what I mean. It's complicated. It's multifaceted. And even in your conclusion, you said that you see these wonderful moments of families being reunited. I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I'm reminded of a story where a Knesset member was speaking against the return of hostages, and outside of the Knesset was a family who was campaigning and screaming very loudly. And he said, I want everybody to know that if I was that parent, I would be in exactly their place right now.
Right.
I'd be screaming and doing everything I possibly could to get my child back because it's my child. And when I am a member of the Knesset and I'm not impacted in a way that is a family member that is directly in captivity, then I feel I have to do what is the right thing. And I almost feel like there is this push and pull between what is the right thing intellectually, maybe halachically. Of course, you showed us a machloket halacha, but then there is this emotional sense that, and if you look at it from a very different way, then which parent would not want for their children to be released no matter what the cost?
Right. And then, by the way, that tension was exactly seen in the Talmudic story of the wealthy man who goes and redeems his daughter at all cost.
Right.
And they say, and the rabbis report the story,
Right.
but they say, maybe it wasn't B'ratzon Chachamim. It's interesting. They didn't say it was forbidden. It wasn't like a strong condemnation. And so, I'm not really critical of families here. I'm really not. Of doing what they can to bring back their loved ones. And particularly, by the way, in this case, because it's like, why are you stopping to do this on the back of my kid's shoulders, of my father's shoulders, whatever it might be? Now you're going to stop? Like, why don't you stop before Shalit? And now that they took it, now you're going to stop the deal? And this is part of the problem, that Israel has never been able to make a clear statement. In fact, after the Shalit deal, there is one of these committees that are appointed. Israel likes appointing committees to examine things, and they appoint a former Supreme Court justice to do it. And they got a very distinguished Supreme Court justice. And the committee got together and said, listen, Israel has put itself in a terrible position where it's incentivizing captives and needs to come out with a clear statement, which will say we won't do this anymore. Otherwise, they're going to keep on doing it. And the answer was, they kept on doing it. And we didn't release anyone for Hadar Goldin and Ron Shaul for their bodies, or for the two civilians that have been taken captive. But now this is feels like a little different situation, and it's one of the situations where you can't avoid it. So I don't know.
To make things more complicated, Rabbi, think of what would happen to those 240 captives if Hamas didn't think that they were valuable tokens. They would have killed them.
Yes, but it could be they wouldn't have taken them in the first place.
They wouldn't have taken them. They would have killed them.
It could be. It could be. Or it could be they wouldn't have had that tactic in the first place. It's hard to know, right? And the question is how you break this cycle. And by the way, it's important to look at other governments and other armies. Right? When America, which has had some soldiers taken captive, they don't negotiate with terrorists. Now, you could say that's a horrible thing. You brought in a soldier, you sent them to Iraq, and you don't do anything for him. Obama sort of broke the rule a little bit, I think, and Trump did also as well. But that was a long time, rule for that. And by the way, there wasn't a lot of American soldiers taken captive. There's a reason for that. It wasn't deemed as being that worthwhile. So the real question is how to break out of this cycle right now. There are many cycles we need to break out of. That's part of the dilemma. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Brody. This was really incredible. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will continue with a slew, please God, of additional programs, both online and in person, at the Shah and at the Shah Learning Center. Be well, and may we hear good news.
Amen. Always wonderful learning with your Kila, and Mirza Hashem, one day I'll come and visit in person. Meet together.
Amen. We would like. Thank you. Bye.
But not in the winter. I've been in Montreal in the winter. I ain't coming back. Bye.